Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to take a look at Africa, the 54, not all 54 African countries, but certainly what many of them are doing in the area to combat climate change, to reduce poverty, as well as some of the economic opportunities in that area of the world. My guest today is an expert on the topics I've mentioned. Dr. Ayodele Odusola, a Nigerian national, is the chief economist and head of the strategy and analysis team for the United Nations Development Program Regional Bureau for Africa. Dr. Odusola, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you for inviting me, Bill.
I appreciate you being with me today. We're going to try to get into as many of these. We'll get into all the topics, but maybe not all 54 African countries. Yes. That's a lot to cover in 26 minutes, but I do appreciate you being with me. Why don't we talk a little bit about your Regional Bureau for Africa? What's the main purpose, the main mission of it?
The United Nations Development Program Regional Bureau for Africa is the bureau within the UNDP that covers the 46 sub-Saharan African countries. And what we do is to work with the government and partners in the 46 African countries to support them to achieve their development priorities, particularly with respect to the Agenda 2063 for the African Union and the 2030 Agenda for the Sustainable Development in Africa.
Very good. And your website is www.africa.undp.org for any of our viewers who want to take a look at it and see more information than what we're going to be able to cover today. There's been and I can't remember when it started, a new partnership for Africa development. NEPAD is what they call it.
Yes.
And what exactly is NEPAD, this new partnership, and what are some of the main, a couple of the main goals of this to help the 54 African countries to accelerate and to raise the standard of living?
Yes. Thank you very much. NEPAD, which we now call the Coordination Unit of the African Union, and it's an organization that was established from 2000 that has been transformed severally to the current situation where it is, because last year, and it's particularly January 19 this year, it was given a new mandate. And the mandate is for NEPAD, coordinating unit of the African Union, to really provide coordination on regional and continental initiatives on the continent. We have infrastructure initiative, we have what they call industrialization initiative, and the latest one is the one we call the African Continental Free Trade Area, which has now, as we speak, has been ratified by the maximum number that is expected for it to become operational, 22 African countries, which we just got about 2 days ago.
Mm-hmm. That is so extremely important to help the entire continent. Now you have a report from Africa Sustainable Development Report 2017. What were some of the findings in that focused attention on some of the challenges in Africa and some of the positive aspects of what's going on?
Thank you very much. The 2017 Sustainable Development Goal Report we did with other Pan-African institutions like the African Union Economic Commission for Africa and African Development Bank found a lot of interesting results. One of it is that we need to invest heavily on data, because whoever generates the data controls the narrative. We then realized that we're not paying adequate attention in terms of data generation for us to be able to monitor the SDGs in Africa. And this is very, the SDG is data intensive. We need to invest heavily in that. And again, we need to really make sure we promote South-South cooperation for us to be able to share lessons and good practices relating to development initiatives, good practices across African countries. We believe that there are so many things that are really moving on in Africa that are happening that are very, very interesting for us to share with other African countries, so that once a problem is solved in one country, the other countries do not need to go through the same problem. It's a matter of adapting it to their own context and make sure they leapfrog development initiative. So this is one of the things we found. And finally, we found that the role of institutions really matters. There are some things that cannot be done at the continental level. For instance, instance, the issue of climate change mitigation and adaptation is beyond the capacity of any country. We are calling on regional entities to really come together and cooperate on how to really address this. You know exactly what is happening as we speak in Mozambique, Malawi, as well as Zimbabwe in terms of Cyclone Idai, in terms of its the impact on the ground. We need to really make sure continental initiatives are used to address issues relating to climate change, adaptation, and mitigation.
I'm glad you mentioned that Cyclone Idai, because
Yes.
that was just absolutely devastating to those three countries. And this is getting more and more frequent. We're seeing more of these storms. We're seeing more violent storms. And they're hitting in places sometimes where they used to never be, but they're certainly showing up nowadays. What are you doing? Now, you mentioned, we'll get to the Sustainable Development Goals in a minute, but are there certain activities that are underway in Africa to bring the regional approach to dealing with climate change? I know you're working with UN agencies, you're working on the Sustainable Development Goal to reverse climate change or slow it down, but are there other activities that are underway?
Well, there are a number of activities that are underway. Part of the things we try to put in place is for us to really make sure that the effort towards using climate smart agriculture is what we are focusing attention on. It's part of what we developed for the Sahel last year through the support plan to the implementation of the UN Sahel initiative, and which we think what we need to do to turn it into land of opportunities, we need to really promote climate smart agriculture. And at the same time, we have to make sure that we invest heavily in dredging, for instance, the Chad Basin Authority, Chad Lake Basin, which has been reduced by almost about 90% over the past 5 decades. We know a lot, the three countries around that, 4 countries, Cameroon, Chad, Niger, and Nigeria, the population around that place use it as a source of livelihood. And that's, again, one of the reasons we have the escalation of the Boko Haram in that region, because the livelihood is totally destroyed, because Lake Chad is going into extinction, losing almost about 90% of its volume over the past 5 decades.
That's an example that we use often on this program. Scientists said that years ago, Lake Chad was as big as a football field, a soccer field. Today it's as big as a soccer ball. It has shrunk that much, and it's not going to get any better. It's going to get worse, and that is certainly going to be the problem. How do you bring, there's so much diversity in Africa. It's rich in tradition and culture. The history in many parts is just incredible. How do you bring 54 countries? You've got the northern tier of Africa, and then you got sub-Saharan Africa. How do you bring all 54 of them together to work together as a block? Is that a challenge, or is a lot of fun to do it? I'm sure.
There's unity in diversity.
Exactly.
That's exactly the main message with respect to African countries. We have different approaches we've done to this. Africa is divided into 5 sub-regions. We have the West, the South, the Central, the East, and the North. So apart from dealing with each of these 5 sub-regions, we bring them together at the continental level. For instance, the one we just mentioned, that while all other regions are disintegrating in terms of regional integration, we are coming together as the bloc. The African Continental Free Trade Area that was signed last year, that will be ratified this year, is the largest entity in the world you can ever think of in terms of partnership on trade agreement. And that's a big plus. People thought it wouldn't be it is totally impossible for you to bring 54 African countries together to agree on a framework like that. But it's been achieved for the first time globally. That's one thing, and we thought that's an opportunity for us to leverage. Because with current level of intra-regional trade, Africa will not be able to accelerate progress on development unless it trades within itself. And one of the things we are talking about, we are working with other Pan-African institutions, is to work with them to be able to facilitate the implementation framework. And that's part of what we are working, we're discussing with African Union, the Economic Commission for Africa, African Development Bank, and the Africa Export-Import Bank, to really make sure that we work with member states to be able to design implementation framework that will make it to be a result-oriented partnership.
Well, as you were speaking, I was thinking back to 2008 when basically the United States, some of the hedge funds, the banks, they basically caused a financial collapse around the world. Yes. How was Africa affected by that? I hear that Africa was not as adversely affected as some of the other countries, maybe or areas like Europe or North America or South America. But how did Africa come out of that? Did they do better than some of the developed countries, economically developed countries is what I'm saying? But did they, because they had small businesses, or how did that work out?
Well, thank you very much. That's really one of the things we're working with African government to really see how they move on with it. They did, at that particular point in time, 2007, 2008, when we had the global financial crisis, the impact was minimal then. But as time goes on, you then realize that because it is affecting the demand for export and imports, especially from the affected countries in advanced economy, it definitely affected trading with Africa. And particularly those that rely on primary commodities started feeling it from the last quarter of 2013, where the commodity price burst really affected them so badly, until recently where the prices of primary commodities started going up. I think that's one thing, which I think a major lesson. But to me, it's a blessing in disguise, because it's an indication that the economic strategy of most African countries are not right. If you continue to export primary commodities, you continue to export the jobs of your country. So you need to add value to those primary commodities in order to make sure you are not totally vulnerable to what is the external shocks. Because once you add value to these primary commodities, it makes you more resilient. And at the same time, it gives you opportunity to maximize the market prices. So this is one thing. It shows that some of the signals we've been having with respect to that is that we need to really make sure African countries diversify and add value to their primary commodities. They should change from exporting primary commodities to exporting finished and intermediate products.
So an example might be, if instead of a country exporting its timber,
yes,
it should be making furniture with that timber, exactly, and then export the finished product, exactly, so to speak, to add value to it.
Value.
That's extremely important.
No, that's it, and we have seen a number of countries that are doing that. The local content policy, which on the basis of that, in 2013, Botswana, for instance, started sorting and polishing diamond for the first time.
Is that right?
Yes, they've started in 2013, and in this year, based on the local content policy that Nigeria is introducing into the oil sector, you'll see the largest refinery in Africa starting operating in the next few months, the Dangote refineries. So it's again adding value to primary commodities so that they don't become exporters of primary commodities alone. These are just a tip of the iceberg in terms of transformation, local content policy, and value addition that is taking place on the continent.
Which is absolutely critical.
Yes.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you've got a website, you like our shows and you'd like to share them, please feel free to do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help us better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're taking a look at Africa, that not all 54 countries, but a large part of that area, to see what they're doing to come together to combat climate change, to reduce poverty, to promote clean energy, and to deal with a myriad of other challenges. My guest is an expert in this area. Dr. Ayodele Odusola is the chief economist and head of the strategy and analysis team for the United Nations Development Program Regional Bureau for Africa. Doctor, you mentioned earlier about leapfrogging, and I'm fascinated with that because you're absolutely correct on that. If we think about the term, the concept information and communication technology, ICT, there are a lot of areas, a lot of ways today that African countries, South American countries, Asian countries, people in other parts of the world don't have to reinvent the wheel, yes, to move ahead. How have things like smartphones helped in the area of banking or something like that, or to help farmers predict what kind of weather they're going to have, or what are the planting conditions? They're using that technology, is that correct?
Thank you very much. Africa is the fastest growing in terms of cell phone subscribers in the world as we speak today.
The fastest.
It's the fastest growing one. Mm-hmm. And again, the issue is that the application of the technology in many fronts, many fields in Africa is huge. And let me just give you one or two examples. The first one is the electronic payment transfer called M-Pesa. M-Pesa was introduced in Kenya about 8 years ago, and now is generating billions of dollars in terms of inclusive financial market. This is where you use telephone to really not only to transfer money to your relatives anywhere they are, not within the country and outside the country, but also to use it to pay bills instead of going to line up in utility companies to pay bills. So that's now, as we speak, is being adopted in at least 15 countries, including India today. That's the kind of model that Africa is exporting to the rest of the world. And let me tell you, there's another one with respect to the issue of the Ethiopian Commodity Exchange. Ethiopian Commodity Exchange, which was supported by UNDP in 2005 to establish, and today, and the reason why we supported them, well, we realized that farmers in Ethiopia work 365 days, but at the end, there's nothing to show for it in terms of profit from their produce. These profits are being carted away by middlemen and women. And we then said, okay, one way to help them is to really find a way of making sure we integrate them to the market. With the support to the Ethiopian Commodity Exchange market, we were able to remove that, because now all farmers that are integrated into the commodity exchange in Ethiopia have the app that can tell them what the price is in Addis Ababa, in any part in Ethiopia, and in the rest of the world. So no middlemen or women could go to them and say the price of a kilogram of coffee is $5, whereas it is about $50 or $30 elsewhere. Right. They will tell you this is the price in Ethiopia, this is the price in Europe, this is the price in America. So you can't cheat them anymore. So they are maximizing the market. And one other thing that is helping the application is that a farmer gets to his farm today and then realize the crops he left about 3 days ago, they were green, have turned brown. So what you need to do is just to take a photo of that, send it to the center, what they call the support center, and they will tell you exactly what is wrong with that crop within 24 hours. You can see how Africa is making effective use of this technology, and it's really helping. And there are so many other countries that I can show you that the use of what they call telephone and some technological advancement in health services is really helping a lot. And we have got to, there is what they call the BA project in a state in Nigeria, where because of what they call the health rangers, a health ranger is where a nurse is attached to about 7 pregnant women to monitor them, where they have access to 24 hours telephone services with their nurses to complain about what is happening to them, and they're taken to delivery homes, and when the time comes, now has reduced maternal mortality in that particular state dramatically. And that's the kind of progress we're looking at in terms of replicating it in other parts of Africa.
Those are good best practices. They certainly are, and they can be replicated in other parts of Africa as well as in other continents too. And of course, Africa is the second largest continent, yes, land-wise and person-wise too, as far as population. So yes, you've got a lot of diversity going on, but yes, still a lot of positive things taking place. I noticed that you co-edited a book, Income Inequality Trends in Sub-Saharan Africa, Divergence, Determinants, and Consequences. Income inequality has turned into a major problem in the United States. It wasn't years ago, but it certainly is today. How is that working out, or how is that developing in Africa, and what are you doing to help overcome that income inequality, which could be very, very destabilizing? Yes. It can be, it's inequitable, yes, it can create poverty, it can move on many fronts. But yes, what are you doing to help overcome that problem?
Thank you very much. One thing that the Regional Bureau for Africa did was to note that we observed that inequality has been heavily documented in Asia and Latin America, but there is not a single comprehensive book on it in Africa. And that's what led to the publication of this book you mentioned, mm-hmm, which is just, this is the summary of it. There's a bigger version that is about 500 pages. And there's another version that we prepared for the chief executives, ministers, and president that they can read in 5 to 10 minutes and get the details in terms of what is happening. Now, with respect to Africa on inequality, what we know is that there are good practices and there are bad practices. These South African development communities happen to be the most unequal region in the world. Because they have the largest Gini coefficient. That's the measure we use to know the gap between the haves and the have-nots. It shows that in Africa, we cannot generalize that inequality is high in Africa. But what we know is that there are 7 outlier countries in Africa on inequality. Once you remove these 7 outliers countries out of the 54 African countries, the rest of Africa perform relatively on the world average of the level of inequality. And I just give you about a few of these outlier countries. We have South Africa, we have Namibia, we have Botswana, we have Lesotho, we have Zambia, we have Central African Republic, as well as Seychelles. So these are as well as Comoros. So these are the 7 outliers. Once you remove them from the African continent, the average for the rest remains comparable with what is happening in the rest of the world. I just want to show you, give you an example. You won't believe there is a country that needs to be well emulated. It's Burkina Faso. That is the country that has succeeded in reducing both poverty and inequality over the past 2 decades consecutively. It's very rare to get that type of country in the world. And that's really one thing we have to note, that even the big countries can go there and to learn what is making it happen. We know we have identified 3 groups of drivers of inequality. Now, the first one is about the structure of the economy. Once you have in most African countries where there is a wide dichotomy between the former and the former sectors, then it becomes an opportunity for you to really make sure the informal sector is generating income for very few, probably 10 to 15% of the population, whereas the informal sector with low income and poor working conditions is generating for almost about 85% of the population. You can see that's why one of the reasons. So there is the dichotomy of the structure of the economy. Now, the second one is the concentration of assets in one particular region or one particular area relative to what is happening in other parts of the country. The over-concentration of what they call physical assets, like roads, like water, schools and water, school, and health services, is really creating inequality in most African countries. And at the same time, the capacity of government to really distribute public wealth effectively through progressive taxation and what you call equitably efficient distribution of social safety net to those that are falling behind. These are the 3 major things we consider to be the major drivers. And we thought we're working with many of our countries to be able to address this. But one thing which we found from that book is that factors that help you reduce poverty are not necessarily the same factor that help you reduce income inequality. For instance, the issue of productivity, you increase productivity through ICT. It will help you to accelerate poverty reduction, but it may create inequality if it is not backed with progressive tax system, and if it is not backed with an efficient and effective social protection mechanism that is able to carry along people that fell below the market because they cannot benefit from the market trend. These are the kind of things, the findings we found, which we consider to be very important in moving it forward. And on the basis of that, there is what we call the tree of equity, which we put in the book, which is really helping to really, you can see the tree of equity. That is what the policy that we need to really nurture and plant tree of equity in Africa. This book contains everything. We'll send it across. And it can be reached, people can access it directly from our website.
Mm-hmm. Well, it sounds like there are a lot of positive things going on in Africa and amongst a large number of the countries there. And of course, we're all combating many of these problems together. We all deal with climate change. We're all dealing with problems like human trafficking, just on across the board. And it's income inequality. As you mentioned, there were 6 or 7 outlying countries there that really took the lead. You take them out and things are a lot better. In fact, Africa is way ahead of the United States and several other countries in that particular from that particular perspective. But it is really an exciting time, and even it's a very challenging time, and it's one that we do have to pull together. And I know you're doing that with your 54 countries. You're doing it with the NEPAD agreement. You're working through the United Nations agencies and trying to focus on these problems to overcome them and to at least slow them down or reverse them. Hopefully we can do that with climate change, although some of the scientists are saying we're getting a little too far along on that, but we still can't give up. We have to keep trying. Yeah. But Dr. Odusola, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure meeting you and discussing with you.
My pleasure. We'll do it again. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I appreciate it. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.